Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Sridhar Muppidi. I'm the technical leader at IBM Security. I'm joined by my colleague Shane Weeden, who focuses on identity and access management leadership at IBM. Today, we are talking about our journey into passwordless authentication at IBM, focusing specifically on our workforce. IBM, for those of you who don't know, is a multinational company across 170 countries. We have close to 500,000 plus workforce, which includes employees, contractors, supplements, and we have a variety of applications around 4,000 plus or minus based on different types of activities that we do. Today, we want to spend some time talking about how this workforce experiences authentication, and then talk about how FIDO can help improve that experience, and then end with some of the best practices as we are embarking on this journey of passwordless authentication. So for these 500,000 plus workforce, they are accessing a number of different applications. Some of them are heritage applications, some of them are SaaS applications, some of them are cloud native applications. So a variety of different mechanisms, but we have consolidated the authentication to a consistent platform between providing federated single sign-on and or behind a reverse proxy, so that they're experiencing authentication in a seamless manner with a seamless branding. However, for the entire workforce, we subject them to a conditional 2FA validation on every session. This is basically checking to see if they're coming from the same device, if they have validated the device in the last X number of days, making sure that there is no other risk indicator. And then based on that, we evaluate the risk. And if the risk is high, we subject them to a two-factor authentication. It's about 25,000 2FA authentications today. And as you can see, from the right-hand side, most of the authentication or 2FA techniques are somewhat heritage, SMS and email, and primarily based on the fact that how most of our employees have devices and how their registration is set up. And if you look at from an experience perspective, they usually try to go to an application. The application could be hosted within IBM or could be a SaaS application like Box or Slack or any such productivity tool. And as the employee is trying to access this application, we redirect them to our intranet site. That's what you see on the left-hand side. And then we subject them to that conditional access check. And then based on the risk, we then apply the 2FA to about 25,000 that you see in the dotted box over there. And for that 25,000, we provide a number of different types of 2FA mechanisms, depending upon what the employee may have registered in their profile. And then based on that, the employee then chooses the right technique, does a 2FA, and the sequence is then completed by going to the specific application and doing single sign-on. Now, this is way better than where we started, but our journey is not complete. We are embarking on passwordless. We want to do way better than this. So what Shane is going to talk about in the next section is how 2FA influenced by FIDO is going to help us improve that experience, and then talk about our best practices in embarking on that journey.
Thanks, Sridhar. And can I just say that this experience is pretty common in enterprises today, and certainly the feedback we've got from our employees is it can be quite painful, particularly for the delivered one-time password capabilities. Not only is that inconvenient, you've got this asynchronous delivery going on. You've then got to go and collect that data and enter it. It's also not considered best practice or state of the art when you look at security standards, particularly around SMS delivery. So this is a look at our current iteration of an experience of alternative to password authentication using FIDO on our intranet that we're deploying at the moment. And instead of a login screen like you saw on the previous slide that prompts you for your username and password and then conditionally applies two-factor, you'll see that we actually have totally removed that from the user experience. It does actually exist. It exists under this little link down here, sign in with your W3ID credentials. So you can fall back to heritage multi-factor, conditional multi-factor experience. But we're leading with our passwordless options here. And in fact, we're leading right at the top with what is essentially a FIDO passwordless login. So having selected that first option, I'll go through a typical FIDO authentication experience. And this is one where I have used Google Chrome on my MacBook to perform authentication. So Chrome takes over when the FIDO authentication APIs are called. And then I get, depending on what type of authenticator I'm using and the user verification method, whether it's PIN or fingerprint, or platform authenticator or roaming security key, I'll get a slightly different browser-specific version of that experience, and I'm logged into the app. And that is the entire experience. And you'll notice at the bottom of this slide, it says no conditional 2FA required. And that's because the factors of something plus something you have or are rolled up into the FIDO experience with user verification. Okay, so it's not just a matter of having my security key. I must also have the PIN or fingerprint used to perform user verification on it. Now, our CIO user experience team has decided to do some client-side platform discovery and slightly alter this experience based on the operating system platform or device you're using. And I've just captured from a Windows system here what that login screen or the start of that login screen looks like if I was on Windows 10 with Windows Hello. So we have made that choice to try to present a user experience that's using terminology that's most understandable or familiar to the employee. And I think the thing I want you to take away from that is that introducing a new technology like FIDO2 authentication is going to result in the introduction of new terminology, and it's going to take a little while for employees to become familiar and comfortable with that. And this is something that the FIDO Alliance themselves is still settling on, is how do we educate the masses on what this technology is called, and how do we help relying parties that are deploying this technology to offer consistent terminology and experience when using it. So just for the technophiles out there, I do want to share some of the many possible options that are available in FIDO and what we chose to use in this iteration. And I say in this iteration because we are looking at ways to further refine the authentication experience. But for the time being, this is what we chose to do. And this is really the flagship experience that FIDO is pushing, which is to completely replace the need for passwords and not just use FIDO for a second factor mechanism. Now, in our deployed environment, we do absolutely permit FIDO authenticators to be used for a second factor experience. So you can actually enter your username and password and then perform second factor with a FIDO experience. However, we've targeted the full alternative to password login experience. And to do that, we've used during the registration phase the settings that I've shown here, which is specifically to require a resident key or discoverable credential to be created with user verification. The little note there about attestation and why I circled that is that in enterprise deployments, attestation is typically desirable. So your employer has an understanding of what authenticators the staff are using if you're not issuing them directly, whereas in most consumer deployments that would be set to none. And then when we display, that login screen and set up our FIDO options for login or assertion, as otherwise known, we always require user verification during that flow, and this is what permits us to not require a multi-factor experience. And I've got a little note there about the absence of an allow credentials list. The absence of the allow credentials list is something we've chosen to do this time around. I'm not closed that that's the way it will always be, but that requires the use of the require resident key flag in the attestation options, or the creation of a discoverable credential, as it's now known. So that's what we're doing in our registration and login experiences in terms of the settings that are on the wire. I think it's also useful for folks to hear about our journey to this new intranet identity provider, because most companies, including IBM, and we have a very large deployment, have an existing heritage federated identity provider. And it's not just a matter of one day you have one and the next day you have another. You kind of have to do it in a journey, and you have to manage risk as you're doing that. And I think understanding that journey helps people plan their own. And so I thought I'd share some of that with you. So we already had a intranet-based identity provider, the one that delivers on the multi-factor, the conditional multi-factor experience that Sridhar talked about earlier. And that's what employees authenticate today for pretty much all of our productivity apps. What we're doing is we're actually moving to a SaaS-based identity platform that IBM itself builds and markets. And it's on that platform that we have delivered on our passwordless login experiences. And I know I've listed a couple there, not just FIDO. We do have another form of passwordless login experience as well. I personally prefer FIDO to the alternative because we still use conditional multi-factor on the alternative. It's just a way of bootstrapping low assurance authentication without a password. So I prefer the FIDO experience on devices where that can support it. And we still offer conditional two-factor there, same as we did on our heritage system. However, we only employ that conditional two-factor when it's necessary. So for FIDO flows, we don't need it. And then what we did was when we set up this cloud-based identity service, we synchronized all our employee user data, and that's a continual process. So that happens all the time during this migration. And then we've started to migrate a little bit at a time apps to the new identity provider system. So if you think about it in terms of a SaaS app, we essentially reconfigure those apps to use a new identity provider for SAML or OpenID Connect. In that period, which is going to occur over some time, employees may have to log into both identity providers, even though they're using the same data and in most cases the same registrations and mechanisms. They will have to authenticate to those two different portals depending on which apps they're using that day. And that's something we've chosen to do and accept because it's part of our risk mitigation strategy. So with that, I want to talk about some of the things that we've learned along the way of deploying FIDO, and we're still learning. Some things we've accepted and some things we're looking to iterate on and improve. So the first thing I want to bring up is an observation about the registration of a FIDO authenticator when we're setting up FIDO for employees. One of the challenge here is that in the wild, there are many different types of authenticator models and makes and capabilities available. And some of them, in fact, many of them only support the second factor experience because they don't support discoverable resident keys. And we do have a way for people to register those insofar as they can then use them simply as a second factor capability. So you still enter your username and password, or in fact, you can use the QR login mechanism and then use your FIDO Authenticator for second factor only. But the registration experience, which I didn't take you through in this presentation, but that registration experience is a little bit awkward because you have to change that set of attestation options that I showed. And if you are unable to detect ahead of time whether or not the person has an authenticator that's capable of resident keys. And if they try and register a authenticator that isn't capable, they sort of get a hard error, and we have to then guide them back to a second registration experience, which sets require resident key to false. So that was one of the first things that I worked on when I joined the W3C and the WebAuthn spec community, and we've introduced a new capability into the level 2 version of WebAuthn, which allows you to just use one registration experience and have the relying party understand what actually got provisioned. So hopefully browsers will adopt WebAuthn Level 2 when it's published, and we'll start to be able to improve that registration experience for the masses and just be able to tell them, hey, you registered this type of authenticator, and as a result, you can now take advantage of the following types of experiences, whether it be the full passwordless login experience or just second factor. There's also some things that we've experienced based on the choices of the attestation and assertion options that we've chosen to use. And what we're looking to do there is to perhaps improve that experience based on some new work that's happening in the public domain, led by the FIDO Alliance, called the How to FIDO protocol, which is a way of using the FIDO options to permit, I would say, fewer dialog boxes when a user's logging in. Okay, is probably the best way to describe it. There's also a few things that employees could do that can result in some rough edges in the user experience. For example, if they go into their security profile on the server and delete a registration, you kind of end up with this situation where an authenticator may believe it has a credential that they can use for passwordless login, but that's been wiped off from the server. And you get a hard error when that happens. And at the moment in the interfaces to a FIDO authenticator, there's simply no way to granularly delete a single registered credential. That interface doesn't exist. So even if a user wanted to do that, they have to do a full reset of the key, and that's an experience that we really can't fix as a relying party. We really need the interfaces in the authenticator and then in the browsers or other tools for managing authenticators to be able to do that. And then there's a little bit of a moving target here with respect to how different how advanced different browsers are in their implementations of the standards, and this can sometimes result in experiences where, and I'll give you an example on macOS, where certain types of registration and login will work on Chrome, but they won't work on Firefox. This is improving all of the time as the browser vendors continue to pour WebAuthn into their implementations, and we're hoping we get to a point in the not too distant future where that level of support is ubiquitous enough that these problems are ironed out. So just in terms of some sort of summary here, what I really like to say is we're really excited about giving it a go. We are a technology company, and if we can't experiment with this technology on our employees, then who could? So we're really happy to be trying this out and getting it in front of our employees and getting feedback. And we hope that the lessons that we learn inside the house translate to both improvements in our own deployment and improvements in the standards themselves, which I work in every day with a really strong community of other vendors. We also want to iterate on profiles of FIDO and use of the web authentication standard that suit both consumer and enterprise deployment, and that work has begun under the How to FIDO initiative in the FIDO Alliance. And as a implementer and deployer of what is essentially a relying party in this framework or in this architecture, I'll continue to lean on particularly the operating system and browser vendors to work towards consistent implementation, so that as a relying party we can offer consistent user experiences for both employee and consumer use cases. And with that wraps up our story today. And on behalf of Sridhar and I thank you for your attention, and I hope you got something out of it, and we'd be happy to take your questions.